This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host Renee Williams. And today in studio we have Dr. Jeff Stringer and Chris Will. And Dr. Stringer is the chair of the UK Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and he's also an extension professor of hardwood silviculture and forest operations. And we also have Chris Will in studio, and Chris is the president of Central Kentucky Forest Management, which is a forestry consulting business. And it's a pleasure to have you two in studio today.
Yeah, glad to be here this morning.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. And so before we get started talking about the Lhotka initiative, tell us a little bit about how you got interested in forestry. Chris, do you want to start?
Sure. So growing up, I always enjoyed outdoor activities, fishing, camping, hiking. And I was very fortunate growing up in Western New York to be close by the State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. And I graduated from that program, made my way to Kentucky as I was looking for employment.
Good. Well, we're glad you're here. And Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about how you got involved?
Well, like Chris, I spent a lot of time in the outdoors when I was growing up, hunting, fishing, that kind of thing. Family farms in central Indiana. So I have a farm background and used to growing things. I know in high school I was reading some information on forestry and how a lot about forestry had to do with growing trees. And I thought, well, I could do that, and wound up getting a 4-year degree in that and then going on from there. So my interest really comes from agriculture and the love of the outdoors.
Okay, great. Well, today we're going to be discussing the White Oak Initiative. So can you tell us what exactly is that?
It's interesting how it developed. Before we talk about the initiative, I'm going to let Chris give us a little background about white oak and why we're interested in it and what's going on with it, and then I'll explain a little bit about how the initiative got started and what it is.
Okay.
Sure. So white oak is a very valuable forest product. White oak trees produce hardwood lumber that's used in the furniture and cabinetry industries. It also can be used for cross ties, railroad cross ties. But its highest and best values are producing staves used in the construction of barrels for the whiskey industry and wine industry, and also flat sliced hardwood veneers, also used to manufacture furniture and architectural millwork.
Now, so white oak has a lot of different uses. You use it everything from cross ties underneath the railroad track, so to speak, to making barrels out of it. And so where the initiative got started, really, it's we had a growing interest in bourbon and whiskey production going on, and that was causing a greater demand for barrels and a greater demand for high-quality white oak trees that go into barrels. And this started several years ago, and we were watching the trends as we do with these things economically and looking at the amount of material that was being harvested and the price and all that kind of thing. And we've been covering that. Had a couple opportunities to speak to the economic importance of white oak and the prices for some of this stuff going up, and that got the interest of the distilling industry. We started to have a lot of conversations in forestry in general with the distillers at that time. This is 5-6 years ago, about the sustainability of white oak, because they really didn't understand how white oak grew, where it came from, and that kind of thing. And you think so, but really they were about making whiskey and bourbon, not so much worrying about what's going on in the forest. But they became interested in that really quick, in the sustainability of white oak. So we conducted 2 meetings in 2015, and one in 2015 and one in 2017, on the sustainability of white oak. And we did this mainly to get information in front of the forest industry and the distillers and all those that were using oak and white oak. In the case of the distillers, are very white oak dependent because the barrels are made out of white oak. So we got information in front of those groups in those 2 years in these conferences on how white oak grew and the growth and drain on it and all that kind of thing. And that spurred a lot of interest in making sure that we had white oak available in the future. Because white oak trees, as Chris knows, taking 60, 80, and for barrel trees, sometimes 100, 120 years to grow. So if you're going to be if you're wanting to supply that in the future, you got to be thinking about it now. And so it was from those meetings that there was interest in forming like a partnership or something around white oak to start communicating about it and that kind of thing. And it was in meetings I had with American Forest Foundation and Brown Foreman, who had interest in doing something. It was from those conversations that we actually started the idea, hatched the idea of the White Oak Initiative. And that was formed a couple years ago. We have a steering committee that is regionally diverse and sector diverse, meaning we have people on the steering committee that are obviously involved in white oak using industries, including the distilling industries, but also wood industry, traditional wood industries. Now, we have people that are interested in white oak that are on the steering committee from state agencies and federal agencies, nonprofits. Turkey Federation is in it, Nature Conservancy is in it. A lot of people are involved. There's about 20 or so on the steering committee. And the steering committee met to form this thing, and it's just recently really launched and got going. And you can get more information on it at whiteoakinitiative.org is the website, and actually sign up to become a member of it. But really, this White Oak Initiative grew out of the interest of industry primarily, and all of us that are involved in white oak conservation and growth and all that kind of thing coming together, right, and recognizing that we needed to do something now to ensure good forest management that would ultimately lead to our ability to have oak and it be available in the future. White oak is a very prevalent species in the region, and Chris will talk a little bit more here in a few minutes about where white oak grows and that kind of thing. But it's fairly common, and there's a lot of supply out there now. But because of the long time frames of its growth and development and stuff, you have to be worried and thinking about 50 or 100 years from now. Now, that's a disadvantage forestry has compared to agriculture, because you can't grow a crop in 3 or 4 months or growing season. So we've got to get on it pretty early. And luckily, the industry responded to the information they had on how white oak works by recognizing they needed to get involved with good forest management now to make sure that they have enough of this white oak timber out there and white oak wood out there to make the barrels that we need, down the road. So that's a little bit of history, a long-winded history of the White Oak Initiative, but interesting. And it's nice to see a wide number of partners coming together that have interest in good forest management, because we don't always see that, So Chris, give us a little bit of idea about where white oak grows, geographically and that kind of thing.
White oak grows in the central to eastern part of the country. Typically, barrel manufacturers are purchasing white oak logs from 24 different states, and this is a widespread, abundant resource in the United States right now. But it's the particulars of white oak reproduction and regeneration that have us concerned. We know that white oak has developed certain adaptations that allow it to persist in the forest floor, but maybe over time or through certain forest practices that we can increase the amount of vigorous reproduction in the forest.
I think a lot of people, Chris, don't understand. People don't think a lot about how trees grow.
Right.
They see the forest, it's out there, leaves are out there, it's all good. And forests actually develop and grow and change over time. A lot of times we just see a little snapshot of that, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years or so, which is a short period of time relative to forest development. And a lot of people think about sustainability of a species might have to do, if we're gonna help the species out, we're gonna plant trees. Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the normal thing. They do that with southern pines. Down south, you plant trees, you harvest and replant. Here in the hardwood territory, we have oak hickory forest like we have here in Kentucky. Chris, give us a little bit of idea, because this is important, about how we regenerate forests. How does that work?
So often we're not dealing with just one species when we're talking about good forest management. We're trying to find a forest type that's well suited for the conditions that are present. And our abundant forest type, and one of the most valuable, is the oak hickory forest type. When we are practicing good forest management and we're trying to increase or maintain oak hickory forest types on the landscape, we're talking about implementing good forest practices. We're interested in making decisions prior to timber harvesting. We want to make sure that we have advanced reproduction of the species, the desirable species present in the woods, before we make the harvest.
So what happens, so what you're saying, Chris, then is what happens, instead of us going out there planting trees, our forests, our oak hickory forests, for many species, they will, in the case of, let's just take white oak, right, or any oak, so they produce acorns, the standing tree, the big trees do. Those acorns hit the ground, and they germinate and turn into small seedlings that are on the forest floor, as Chris was saying. And we call this advanced regeneration. And what we mean by that is the forest is naturally regenerating itself. In this case, through acorns, the establishment of seedlings underneath on the forest floor, on the ground, maybe 1 foot, 2 foot tall, those kind of things. And those slowly grow. And good forest management for regenerating oaks would mean that we try to make sure that those little oak seedlings that are growing in the understory of a mature forest have the ability to start to grow and get 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 foot tall. So they are established already in advance of, for example, a timber harvest. Okay? And so then let's say we have mature trees out there, we have a harvest, and we cut those down. Those small seedlings then have the ability to generate new trees for the future. So a lot of forest management here is not about planting trees, although we can do that and do that in places. But really it's about managing the forest in a way that helps Mother Nature facilitate the natural regeneration of the forest. And Chris, I know you've worked with a lot of landowners on practices that help do that, help encourage that growth of those seedlings. Can you want to tell us a little bit about how some of that works?
Sure. As a consulting forester, I'm working with private landowners that own forest land. Primarily, they own these lands for a multitude of reasons, recreation, as well as recreation, wildlife purposes. And we do find that these people eventually harvest timber on many of their forests. So what's important here is that people choose to harvest timber. And if they're going to work or do these timber harvests within the oak hickory forest type, they need to set the stage for successfully regenerating oak in the future. These practices often require that we disturb the forest in some way, reduce the competing vegetation at the lower levels of the forest vegetation, and also that we change the overall light conditions on the forest floor. So we do this. We work with landowners. We're conscious of the cost and economics of implementing these practices. So very often we use an herbicide treatment to reduce competing vegetation and allow the proper amount of light to contact the small, low-vigor white oak seedlings on the forest floor. Over time, these seedlings and saplings start to develop, become larger and more vigorous, and have the ability to eventually become a oak hickory forest in the future after the overstory is removed.
So the bottom line is this: all this is taken. The majority of the forest land in the eastern U.S. is owned by us, private citizens, right? Mm-hmm. That Chris, give us some idea of these landowners you're talking about that are involved in this. So give us an idea what a typical landowner is.
A landowner that we work with could own as few as 10 or 15 acres of forest land, or as much as a couple of thousand acres. So our typical landowner is approximately 300 acres in size, and that's a size at which a lot of these forest practices could be executed or implemented along with some of the other activities, recreational uses and recreational opportunities that they use on the forest.
Yeah. Kentucky, for example, half the state is forested, so we got 12 million acres of forest. And I think the last time, if you look at the stats, somewhere about 100,000, maybe 110,000 individuals own 10 acres or more, right? So we got a lot of individuals that own landowners. And this is true for not just Kentucky, but all the states around us in the east. So we have a lot of people we have to work with. Chris deals with, and consulting foresters deal with helping them with technical aspects out in the field, as do state forestry agencies. Of course, the university, we deal with, trying to provide education for all that and that kind of thing. So it's a big job trying to get to that many people. And so forest management is about, and having a supply of white oak in the future in this case, is about getting landowners, right, to try to implement good forest practice from the standpoint of oak, where you're trying to make sure that you have lots of oak seedlings underneath a mature forest, right, that are ready to then be able to regenerate it. And that's a tall order given as many people as we have that are involved.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
If you think about the use of oak, we talk in terms of a supply chain, simply meaning that it starts out in the woods with trees owned by woodland owners, like as Chris has described. And then from a timber standpoint, you have loggers that are involved. We have 1,100 to 1,200 logging firms, both temporary and full-time here in Kentucky. So that's a large number of individuals out there that can harvest timber. And then, of course, you have the industries that use them. In the case of making barrels, you have industries that cut the individual pieces that are used in the barrel, and then you have the industry that actually makes the barrels. So that constitutes a supply chain. So a lot of people are involved up and down that supply chain to make all this work. The initiative is about to help bring all that together, help provide opportunities for awareness that a lot of landowners, Chris, aren't even aware that there is something called forest management.
That's correct. I think what's important that most landowners should know or realize is that they should start the process of assessing or learning more about their forest and timber production well in advance of making the decision to harvest timber. Mm-hmm. We encourage landowners to get an assessment or a forest management plan in place well before the time they decide to harvest timber. That forest management plan is going to help identify forest health issues. It's going to talk to them or address specifically the need for a reproduction or regeneration plan. So we're given enough time in advance of that harvest to influence species composition in the next stand. If there's one thing that's a challenge, is that many of the landowners purchase the land or acquire the land, obtain this forest land, and they're thinking about their everyday practices, the recreational uses of the property. But when it comes to the harvest, sometimes that's made without a lot of forethought and planning. And that's what we want to encourage in good forest management, is that planning activity well in advance of the harvest.
So you've mentioned there's a lot of uses, obviously, for white oak, whether it's industry or tables and chairs and things like that. So why white oak and not some other tree species?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, we are concerned, as Chris mentioned earlier, our forests are comprised of a lot of different species, right? Mm-hmm. If you look here in Kentucky, we've got probably 40 species of trees that will get large and you could use for one thing or another, right? And so white oak is just one of those that happens to be important, and historically we've used it for a lot of different things, white oak. Mm-hmm. We still do. We make a lot of flooring out of it, right? We make trim work and cabinetry and all those kind of things, and stair treads and all of that. It's particularly important. The reason we do those things is because, one, white oak's hard, has a nice grain pattern, it looks pretty, and it's hard, so it's good for floors. Okay, Chris, you want to speak to this about why white oak particularly is useful for barrels?
Sure. So the bourbon industry tells us that the white oak barrel contributes 100% of the color to bourbon, mm-hmm. and 80% of its flavor. So, if you're interested in bourbon, you should be concerned about white oak barrels, because to make bourbon, the spirit must be aged in a white oak barrel. It's a law established.
So no other species.
No other species. And I don't think that they would really want to use too many other species. There's some unique characteristics of white oak and the manufacturing of that barrel that make it a nice tight package, and also contribute to the color and the flavor of the product.
So barrel is kind of funny when you ask why white oak. White oak, as Chris said, as that whiskey sits in that barrel over time, it absorbs things out of the wood, right, if you will. And some of those things lend itself to the taste. And Chris alluded to this, but white oak has wood properties, gives it the ability to hold liquid in a wooden barrel very well without it leaking out. And there's a physical property of that white oak has that many other species don't. It's that property which makes it valuable for putting any kind of liquid in. And it just so happens that with the flavoring you get out of it and whatever, it's a good species to be able to, one, make a barrel that'll hold liquid for 4 years or 5 years or 20 years, right? Without too much leakage and that kind of thing, as well as impart flavor. They figured that out. Our bourbon producers have figured that out. And our whiskey producers have figured that out, right? And that's why white oak is important for them. And they're very dependent upon having white oak out there. We have sawmills in the state that harvest all kinds of different species and cut different species into boards and lumber and cross ties and all those kind of things. And white oak is even important for them because it's such an important part of our forest that a lot of the lumber they produce and wood they produce for all these different things is white oak. While you have white oak dependent industries like the distilling industry, for example, and those that make barrels and that kind of thing, you also have a lot of forest industry that's very interested in white oak, but it's what we grow, and we've got a lot of it, and the states around us do. And so it's a very important part of our overall forest industry sector, if you will. And so now white oak, oddly enough, or well, it's not oddly enough, but it's also important for wildlife. So we've talked a lot about wood and about barrels, but Chris will tell you, and he mentioned this before, that a lot of our landowners are interested in wildlife, and recreation opportunities in the woods and wildlife, and white oak has one of the most preferred acorns of any oak species that we have. There's lots of different oak species. Any one woods you're allowed to walk into might have 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of oak growing. And white oak has the most palatable acorn. So what that means is when wildlife eat it, they get the maximum amount of food benefit out of it compared to eating a red oak acorn, for example. So there's a lot of interest, Chris, wouldn't you say, in white oak from a wildlife perspective?
Yes, absolutely. So many of the landowners that we serve have an interest either directly in hunting or through hunting leases. And so that could either provide them income or annual recreational opportunities. And we try to sell a lot of our practices as being just that, beneficial both in the long term to producing additional oak hickory forest types, but in the short term, providing preferred habitat for those species that they prefer to hunt in the fall and spring of the year.
We've got non-game species that use white oak too. We got birds that neotropical migrants, those are the ones that migrate, like warblers, for example. That some of them will use white oaks preferentially. We have certain bat species that will use white oak. White oak is one of those key species in our forest that generate a lot of value to us. Whether it's timber value or bourbon value, that's value from a conservation standpoint and wildlife habitat and wildlife food and those kind of things. And that's one of the things that's interesting about the white oak initiative, because I mentioned before, is you've got a lot of interest in white oak and a lot of entities that are on the steering committee, organizations and nonprofits that aren't timber focused, that are more conservation focused and interested in keeping the white oak dominated and forests that have white oak in it present and working, and maintaining those forests and conserving them, as well as providing for wildlife, whether it's ruffed grouse or turkey or deer and all those kind of things that we tend to like to hunt and have fun with and then get enjoyment out of. The white oak has the ability to produce a variety of those benefits for us. So this initiative hits a lot of different interest, if you will, okay? And it's a species that has value for a wide variety of these interests, and that's what makes it so valuable. Not just the timber, which is in itself money, but it's all these other things too that makes it so interesting, I guess.
So it sounds like the initiative began because of a lot of different reasons.
Absolutely.
You know, the importance of white oak in our forest systems overall for all these different things, you know, is something that has fueled the white oak initiative. Chris, from the standpoint, if landowners are interested, industry knows how they're interested in white oak, and they've come up to speed on what it takes and are supporting sustainable, you know, forest management. But from the standpoint, if you were going to be giving advice right now to landowners, right, that want to get involved in forest management, you know, so what would be a first step for them?
So the first step is collecting all the information that you can get your hands on, and there are some great sources of information. University of Kentucky Forest Extension. You can go to their website, and I'm sure we'll be able to post that. Mm-hmm. There is a wide array of information, and it's going to take some time to digest that, but it's a good reference, and you'll always go back to that site to continue to learn and go deeper on certain subjects. Kentucky Woodland Owners Association, each state in the White Oak region has woodland owner associations. We could provide links to those different organizations. That's an opportunity for a landowner to reach out to other landowners and learn from their experiences, what worked well and what didn't. And one of the probably the primary sources of gaining knowledge about your particular forest is working with Natural Resource Conservation Service, part of the USDA. That's a federal organization, but each state has local offices, regional offices, and an individual usually can contact their local county agent to determine what programs are available to them. And they have extensive programs to help landowners develop forest management plans, and then even some funds to follow through on implementing the practices which are recommended inside those plans.
All right, Chris, so talking about advice to give landowners, I guess, you know, and there's a lot of them out there. And one thing we need to mention, too, is we have the Kentucky Division of Forestry. Every state that has any kind of forest in them has a state agency that's involved with providing technical expertise to landowners in that state, and they help fight forest fires as well. And in Kentucky, we have the Kentucky Division of Forestry that does that. And they're another source of information for landowners. And sometimes the first point of contact landowners have with forestry is through the state agency. So the Kentucky Division of Forestry can find them online as well, can provide assistance to landowners. And you're a consulting forester, and you consulting foresters provide assistance to landowners, right? You've mentioned that. So what's the website where they can find more information about consulting foresters?
The Association of Consulting Foresters of America is a organization which promotes the profession of consulting foresters, and they have a website, acf-foresters.org. One can go to that website and search the directory for a forester near them. Consulting foresters provide forestry services for a fee, but there's a good return on investment there. And these individual foresters are going to be very familiar with the local markets for timber. They're going to understand the forest types that occur in that area, and they're going to be able to assist you with cost share information, even different organizations that may help promote fish and wildlife services.
And here in Kentucky, Chris, and Chris was a past president of the Kentucky chapter of Association Consulting Foresters, and that website is for Kentucky is www.kacf.org, right?
Correct.
And you can get information on Kentucky Consulting Foresters from that, and I'd suggest everybody do that. So
sure. There's a directory and a map that shall point you to well-credentialed forester in your area.
So there's lots of places to go for landowners to get help. and for others that are just interested in all this, right? And landowners, particularly the Kentucky Division of Forestry, the Kentucky Association of Consulting Foresters, the website, our website here, ukforestry.org, to get basic information and educational information and that kind of thing. And then the White Oak Initiative itself, whiteoakinitiative.org. So we've got more websites out there talking about how to get help and that kind of thing. So certainly there's lots of opportunities for those that want to know more about this to get up to speed.
So you both have presented us with a lot of great information, and we greatly appreciate that. Would either one of you or both have a takeaway item that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I'll reemphasize the importance of for forest landowners to reach out to professional foresters early rather than later. I think that they need to have an assessment of the forest property and address any forest health issues they may have, invasive species, for example, prior to timber harvesting. So my takeaway would be reach out to one of the available services out there and do it today.
How about you, Jeff?
I think one of the things that's kind of come out when we were talking about white oak is the complexity of our forest. Here in Kentucky and the surrounding states, our forests have lots of species living in them, both wildlife and tree and all that. Managing that is not an accident, right? It takes work, especially when we have to worry about things now like insect and diseases and things that threaten our forest and its overall health, and changing climate that we've got going on now, and storms, all those kind of things. So our forests are complex. There are no simple answers. And for those that are interested in the forest, whether because they're a landowner or they're just interested in the conservation of it, or they're interested in carbon sequestration, or whatever it might be, right? That they need to become sophisticated in their understanding of it, to be able to manage it, to be able to understand policy decisions that are being made and how that affects the world and all those kind of things. So it's not an easy thing. There are lots of opportunities and resources out there for them to get more information, and we would certainly encourage that. Here at the University of Kentucky, of course, we have undergraduate programs and accredited forestry degrees that we're trying to produce students, right, that be able to handle this, and graduate programs, all those kind of things. And we have our extension effort here that tries to get that science out there and put it to use. So the takeaway is our forests are unique, they're complex, and their management and our future enjoyment depends upon us being able to be sophisticated in our understanding of them and being able to have the expertise, interest of landowners to be able to manage them appropriately.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeff and Chris, for joining us today. And if you would like more information on what you heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned now for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
Okay, Matt, that sounds like hail.
It does sound like hail, and if you were underneath it, it probably would feel like hail too. And that is the sound of acorns falling out of a tree.
Acorns,
yes.
Okay.
Which is a kind of an odd sound to pick for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest, but the reason I chose it this week is because acorns play such a vital role for so many of our Kentucky species that this is the time of year that they are looking for those to fatten up before either their migration or the winter, if they're depending on which species you're talking about.
How many species rely on acorns?
More than I can count off the top of my head. Most of our mammal species, whether it be rodents or any of our forest and mammal species, basically, rodents, deer, elk, bear, turkey,
So we've got some
blue
of the big
jays. Blue jays eat a lot of acorns too. Chipmunks and mice. skunks, raccoons, all of
So
those
a lot.
guys. Yeah, it is. And this is why when we talk about oaks and their importance of oaks, and with the White Oak Initiative that we have going on, not only is it important if you're a bourbon drinker,
Right.
but they play such a vital role as for wildlife species that we're very concerned over oak and the mast, which is what acorns are, the type of hard mast that is produced from the trees.
As far as acorns go, is oaks the only one that produces them, or are there other trees?
Oaks are the only ones that produce acorns, but if you were standing under a hickory tree or a beech tree, you might have beech nuts falling on you or hickories falling on you. It all kind of happens at the same time, and they all fall under that hard mass category. And all of them are very important for wildlife and shouldn't. I'm not putting acorns over the rest of them because they all do play a role. A lot of times more common for folks to notice acorns over, say, a hickory nut or a beech nut.
And acorns can vary in size as well,
They
right?
can vary in size. Unfortunately, we should have had Lori in here, Lori Thomas, talk about acorns. But vary in size, and you have years called bumper years where you have more acorns produced about every 2 years on certain trees. So you get a bumper crop.
So that would be a bumper crop.
Well, it
right?
could.
Or not?
That one sounded like it.
Sounded like
obviously.
it, yeah.
But you have bad mass years, and that for some species that can really drive a lot of the population fluctuations we see now. Historically, we had the chestnut, which every year would produce a substantial amount of high quality mast. Unfortunately, we no longer have that.
Right.
So we rely on something that has more fluctuation in the abundance of food that's produced in the oak trees and the hickory trees and the beech nuts.
And do they vary in color from tree to tree, or are they basically the same?
Color-wise, most of them obviously are brownish in color with the cap on the top. The size is probably the biggest difference, where you go from something like a pin oak that has a much smaller acorn that wood ducks and turkeys prefer, to something like a white oak species that have much larger acorns that deer and elk and bear are really looking for.
So can animals just live on acorns during that time and they're happy, or is there other things they need as well?
Well, during certain times, if there is a large amount of acorns, you can ask any deer hunter that if there's a giant mast year in the area that they're hunting in, the deer will do nothing but basically lay under those trees. Yeah, you can probably see them. They'll probably put their heads up and open their mouths if they have enough of them coming down.
Just falling down on them, right?
Just like popcorn, throwing popcorn in the air and open your mouth. Obviously, they have some difficulty digesting them. The oaks have those tannins and everything else in them. We could even eat acorns if you really wanted to, and make some recipes with them.
Have you ever
however,
done
I have not.
I was wondering what they tasted like.
Bitter.
Bitter.
But it is possible.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming in and talking about acorns. Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.